The winter sun rose pale and distant over the plains of Texas. Its light filtered through the faint mist that hung above the barbed wire of Camp Hearne. Inside the wooden barracks, frost clung to the metal bunks and the faint smell of boiled cabbage lingered from breakfast. German women, former auxiliaries, nurses, and clerks, sat in silence, sewing uniforms or folding coarse gray blankets that carried the faint scent of soap and damp wool. Their faces were drawn, not only from hunger, but from something colder than the December air. The quiet conviction that Christmas no longer belonged to them. They had been taught that Americans were crude, vengeful men. The propaganda films back home had shown the United States as a land of noise and greed. Yet here, behind wire, they saw order. Clean beds, fair rations, and rules followed without shouting. But still, the fear remained like a nail lodged too deep to pull. They whispered that Christmas Day would bring punishment, that perhaps they would be made to serve a feast they could not eat. The rumor moved like wind through dry grass, carried softly, never confirmed. Among them sat one woman named Lieselotte Baumann, a former Red Cross clerk from Bremen. She had lost her fiancé in Stalingrad, her father in a British bombing raid, and her certainty about the world somewhere between surrender and the Atlantic crossing. Each evening, when the American guards switched off the barrack lights, she would trace the outline of a small wooden cross her brother had carved for her. The wood was cracked and worn, its edges smooth from worry. "If you keep faith," he had told her, "the world cannot take everything." Yet here, behind wire and surrounded by strangers, even faith had begun to feel like a rumor. That morning, a sergeant with a calm voice and weathered eyes entered the women's hall. He was holding a clipboard, his tone almost apologetic. "Ladies," he said in careful, broken German, "today, you will not work." The women exchanged glances. Not work? It was unheard of. Lieselotte's hands froze around a spool of thread. The sergeant hesitated, then added, "Tonight, Christmas dinner." No one spoke. The word hung in the air like a sound from another lifetime. Weihnachten. It didn't belong in this place of fences and guards. For a long moment, no one moved. Then a quiet ripple of disbelief spread through the room. Some women laughed nervously, others muttered prayers. One whispered, "A trick." Another said, "They want to make us sing for them." The sergeant nodded once, placed the clipboard under his arm, and left. The heavy door shut with a hollow echo, leaving behind only the murmur of confused breath. Outside, the camp buzzed with something unusual. Trucks arrived from the nearby town of Hearne, their beds filled with boxes wrapped in wax paper and crates covered with canvas tarps. Through the cracks in the barrack shutters, Lieselotte watched civilian men and women unloading them. Not soldiers, farmers, shopkeepers, mothers with children. She saw one small girl clutching a tin wrapped in red ribbon. The girl's father gently took it and carried it toward the mess hall. The Germans inside whispered again. Civilians weren't supposed to be near POWs. Yet here they were, smiling at the guards, nodding politely, even laughing softly in the chill air. The day passed slowly, like a film reel winding toward a scene no one believed real. Afternoon brought a faint scent carried by the wind, smoke, salt, and something almost forgotten: roasted meat. The women stopped pretending not to notice. One leaned toward the window seam, eyes wide. "It smells like home," she murmured, and then covered her mouth as if the words were forbidden. As dusk fell, the guards opened the barrack doors. "Mess hall," one called simply. No guns raised, no barking orders. Just that. The women stepped out cautiously, the gravel crunching under worn boots. The horizon glowed orange, the last of the Texas sun slipping beneath the fields. Beyond the wire, faint music drifted from somewhere. A harmonica, playing a slow, uncertain melody. Liselott didn't recognize the tune, but it sounded almost like a prayer. Inside the hall, the air was thick with warmth and light. Long wooden tables had been laid with white paper cloths. Along the center, tin trays overflowed with food. Roast turkey glazed with butter, golden rolls, mashed potatoes heavy with steam, slices of pumpkin pie dusted with cinnamon. The women stopped in the doorway, stunned. Then they saw them, the townspeople of Hearne, lined up beside the guards, holding pitchers of milk and coffee, smiling shyly. One older woman, her hair silver under a scarf, stepped forward and gestured toward the tables. "Please," she said in English, her hand over her heart. "Eat." No one moved. Liselott felt her throat tighten. This wasn't humiliation. It was impossible kindness. A guard nodded quietly. "It's for you," he said. "Merry Christmas." The words cracked something inside her chest. One woman near the front began to cry, the sound small and raw. Another crossed herself. Then, slowly, they sat down. The first bite came hesitantly. The turkey was tender, the bread still warm. Butter melted on the tongue, real butter, not the gray margarine of the camp kitchen. For a moment, silence reigned. Then forks clinked, murmurs rose, and the sound of eating filled the room like the return of life itself. Laughter, awkward at first, grew into something freer. A young American girl passed out small green apples to each table. When she reached Liselott, their eyes met. The child smiled and said softly, "For you." Liselott whispered, "Danke." But her voice broke halfway through. The night deepened. Candles flickered on the tables. Someone, an American sergeant with a soft baritone, began humming a tune. The melody was unmistakable. Silent night. Across the hall, one of the German women, an older nurse, closed her eyes and joined in, her voice trembling in her native tongue. Stille Nacht, Heilige Nacht. Soon, both languages intertwined, English and German weaving together under the rafters. It was not harmony in pitch, but in spirit. Two sides of a war singing the same prayer to the same winter sky. Liselott looked down at her plate, her reflection trembling in the gravy's surface. For the first time since the war began, she did not feel like a prisoner. She felt human again, but memory is not so easily quieted. As the warmth of the meal settled into her chest and the candlelight flickered gently across her face, Liselott could still feel the presence of another world pressing from behind her eyes. Cold streets, broken stone, the screams at the train station when the bombs fell. Her mother's hands, raw from scrubbing ruins. Her brother's silence when the draft papers came. And the sound of boots, always boots, echoing against concrete. Around her, the other women ate slowly, as if their bodies didn't fully believe the food was real. Some still glanced over their shoulders now and then, half expecting the voice of a guard to bark, "Enough!" or to see the meal swept away like a cruel trick. But no order came. The townspeople, having served what they brought, sat in the back or stood quietly by the walls, present but never imposing. One of the older women, with strong farm hands and weathered cheeks, smiled each time a POW looked her way. That smile did more to dismantle fear than 100 speeches could have. Across the table, a girl named Elfrida, barely 19, stared at the flickering flame between bites. Her hand clutched the spoon with a tension that hadn't left her since capture. She had served in the Luftwaffe Communications Division. Once, she had laughed with pilots and danced in mess halls. Now her fingers trembled when she lifted the cup of sweetened coffee to her lips. She said quietly, "They don't look like monsters." Liselott nodded, but didn't answer. There was no need to. They all felt it, that unsettling fracture between what they had been taught and what now stood plainly before them. In training camps, they had seen films showing Americans as uncultured, dangerous, driven by greed and lust. The word Christmas in those settings was usually followed by tales of American soldiers smashing churches or mocking faith. But here, it was hymns and pies and homemade applesauce in glass jars. There were women who had walked from their own kitchens into this prison, carrying food for the enemy. Not out of political motive, but something older, something sacred, perhaps even something biblical. At the far end of the room, a POW with thick glasses named Marta leaned toward an American nurse seated nearby. "Why?" she asked in broken English. "Why do you do this for us?" The nurse looked down for a moment, then replied, "Because it's Christmas, and because my brother was in a camp in Germany. He said someone was kind to him once." The room did not go silent, but something in the air shifted. The acknowledgement that kindness, real kindness, could travel both ways like wind over barbed wire. Not all had received it, no. War had seen to that. But the story of a single act, returned, remembered, was more powerful than the propaganda both sides had swallowed. In one corner of the hall, a small upright piano stood unused. Its finish was scratched, and one of the pedals wobbled. An American chaplain approached it, rolled up his sleeves, and pressed a few keys to test the sound. A soft chord rang out, then another. He turned toward the women. "Any of you play?" he asked. Silence. Then slowly, Frau Neumann, a former choir teacher from Leipzig, raised her hand. She had barely spoken since arriving at Camp Hearne, her voice locked away like something buried. But now she stood, stepped toward the piano, and sat without a word. Her fingers hovered for a moment, then descended. Leise rieselt der Schnee. The room stilled. Even the guards looked up from their coffee. The melody poured into the wooden rafters, gentle and haunting. Snow is falling softly. Even in Texas, where December brings dust more often than flakes, the room seemed to cool. The piano, slightly out of tune, added a fragile human imperfection that only deepened the beauty. Some of the German women hummed, then sang. The Americans didn't understand the words, but they recognized the sound. The ache for home, the yearning for peace, the miracle of music where there had once been commands. Liselott joined in. Her voice cracked, but she didn't stop. She remembered her mother singing that carol during blackout nights, a single candle burning on the windowsill. She remembered the way the wind would howl through the broken chimney, and her mother would wrap her arms around her and say, "It's all right. The war cannot reach Christmas." Tears came freely now. Not loud sobs, but quiet weeping, like thawed ice slipping down the stones of a well. The American chaplain stepped back, letting the Germans have the piano. It was theirs now. Their night. Their carol. Even if just for an hour. Behind the women, on the back wall of the mess hall, the candles cast dancing shadows. They rose and swayed. Long, thin outlines of tired women in threadbare uniforms, gathered not in defiance or despair, but in the fragile, holy stillness of a shared meal. No chains, no orders, just the light. Liselott looked at the others and whispered to herself, "If only the world could see this." The song lingered long after the final note fell silent, like smoke from a candle that refuses to fade. In the hush that followed, there was no applause, only the quiet, steady breathing of people remembering how to be human again. The women sat motionless, hands folded or clasped together, eyes glistening in the flicker of flame. Outside, the wind moved through the camp's wire fences, humming its own low hymn through rusted steel. For Lieselotte, that sound merged with older memories. Of marching songs in Bremen, of church bells drowned by sirens, of the slow unraveling of everything she once believed immutable. She had been raised to think of Germany as invincible, chosen, the torchbearer of a new order. Her teachers, her papers, her government had told her so. But as she watched a young American boy laugh softly while refilling water cups for the prisoners, she realized something her homeland had forgotten: the power of mercy. No speech or pamphlet had ever carried such force. No general had ever commanded such silence. One simple act, a family baking pies for strangers behind barbed wire, was undoing years of belief like thread pulled from a torn sleeve. At the edge of the hall, a woman named Greta Vogel, once a loyal member of the German Labor Front, sat staring at her hands. Her wedding ring had long been pawned for food in Hamburg before the surrender. Her husband, she assumed, was gone with the Atlantic Fleet. She whispered to no one, "It feels wrong to eat like this." Lieselotte turned. "Wrong?" Greta nodded. "We were told they would hate us. And yet, look." Her eyes darted toward the tables of American volunteers. "If they can be kind, what does that make us?" The question hung in the air like smoke, weightless but impossible to disperse. Around them, the women shifted uncomfortably. Each had carried some piece of the Reich inside her, a shard of propaganda, a habit of fear, a pride that had once seemed sacred. Now, it was crumbling quietly under the pressure of a meal served by those they were taught to despise. Across the hall, an old Texas farmer named Thomas McKinney sat near the entrance, hat in hand. His son had died in Italy, fighting the very people seated before him. Yet, he had volunteered to bring food anyway. When a young corporal asked him why, he said simply, "Because someone's son sits on that bench tonight. My boy's gone. Maybe theirs can still go home different." He didn't speak German. But when Lieselotte caught his gaze, something unspoken passed between them. A soft acknowledgement that grief and kindness can live inside the same heart without contradiction. The chaplain walked quietly between the rows, checking that everyone had eaten. His boots made no sound on the wooden floor. He paused beside Lieselotte's table. "You have everything you need?" he asked gently. She hesitated, then nodded. "Yes, thank you." Her English was halting but clear. The chaplain smiled. "You're welcome. It's a hard thing being far from home on Christmas." He moved on before she could respond, leaving her with the warmth of a sentence she hadn't expected to hear. Outside, snow had begun to fall, or something close to it. Fine dust mixed with mist drifted down in the pale glow of the guard tower light. The Texas air was too warm for real snow, but the illusion was enough. Through the mess hall windows, the flakes seemed to shimmer, like the ghosts of a German winter. For many of the women, it was the first time they had looked out at the world without seeing it as hostile. Lieselotte rose slowly and walked to the door. The guard there, a young man no older than 20, nodded as she passed. She stepped outside, feeling the cool air wrap around her face. The camp was quiet except for distant murmurs and the creak of the flagpole rope. She tilted her head up. The sky was wide, unscarred by searchlights or bombers. For the first time in years, it felt safe to look at it. Behind her, the piano started again, a hesitant version of O Tannenbaum. Voices rose, uncertain but sincere. English blended into German, notes stumbling but alive. Lieselotte listened, her breath forming faint clouds in the chill. Somewhere deep inside her, something shifted. A map redrawn, not of borders or nations, but of the human heart. war had tried to tell her where compassion could and could not live. But here, under an open Texas sky, she realized that the boundaries had always been lies. When she returned inside, the Americans were preparing to leave. The townspeople collected their trays, smiling softly as they said goodnight. The older woman with silver hair approached Liselotte's table again and reached into her apron pocket. She handed each of the women a small parcel wrapped in brown paper and tied with string. Inside was a single cookie, baked with cinnamon and sugar. "For tomorrow," she said gently. "So you remember tonight wasn't a dream?" No one spoke for several seconds. Then Elfrida whispered, "Dunka." One by one, the others followed, their voices trembling. The woman nodded, eyes wet, and turned to go. At the door, she paused and looked back. "When the war is gone," she said quietly, "be the kind that feeds others." When the last civilian had gone, the women remained seated. The guards began extinguishing candles, the room dimming slowly into shadow. Liselotte placed her hands over the small paper parcel. Its warmth was fading, but she could still feel the echo of human touch in it. She thought of her brother's words again. "If you keep faith, the world cannot take everything." Tonight, she realized, faith was not in nations or victories. It was in hands that served food to strangers. She looked across the dim hall and whispered to no one in particular, "The world is not what we were told." That night, back in their barracks, the women sat in silence. No one reached for the cards. No one fetched their mending or rolled cigarettes from Red Cross paper. The warmth of Christmas supper still clung to their bones, yet it was not the food that made their hands tremble, but something far harder to digest, the unraveling of certainty. The bunks creaked as someone shifted under a wool blanket. Outside, the faint crunch of boots in gravel echoed beneath a starless Texas sky. The guards were making their rounds, but their steps felt different now. Less like watchmen circling a cage and more like tired men walking a familiar path. Liselotte sat on the edge of her bunk, staring at her small brown parcel. The cinnamon cookie inside had gone cold. She hadn't opened it yet. She couldn't. Something about the paper, the string, the neatness of the knot. It reminded her too much of packages that used to arrive from home, from her mother, before the letters stopped. Across the aisle, Greta reached into the lining of her jacket and pulled out a yellowed photograph, edges curling, corners soft. She held it near the flickering oil lamp. A man in uniform, a child, a woman smiling faintly in the shadow of a flowering tree. She didn't speak, but the photograph did. And for the first time in months, Liselotte didn't look away. "I buried it," Greta said suddenly. "In my boot. When they captured us, I thought they'd take everything." Her voice was brittle but steady. "I thought I had to hide who I loved, as if they'd punish me for remembering." Elfrida, the youngest among them, leaned forward from her bunk above. "I buried mine too," she said. "Only it wasn't a picture, it was a belief." The others turned slowly. Elfrida's face was pale in the lamplight. "I believed we were better," she whispered. "That our country, our people, that we were meant to win, that it was our right, that everything we did was for order." Her voice wavered. "But when that woman gave me pie tonight, she looked at me like a daughter, not an enemy, just a girl who hadn't eaten well in weeks." There was no correction, no rebuke, just the long, quiet weight of realization shared in stillness. It moved through them like winter wind beneath a thin coat. They had all buried something. Frau Neumann, the choir teacher, reached for her own bundle. a thin volume of Goethe's poetry, concealed between two layers of folded cloth. She'd once read it aloud to students in Leipzig, her voice crisp with authority. Now her fingers traced the spine like it was a grave marker. "I used to believe music would survive anything," she said. "But I was wrong. Songs die in war. Words die. The first thing they killed was poetry." Lieselot looked down at the cross her brother carved. She had hidden it in her underclothes during processing, sure the Americans would tear it away. But they hadn't. In fact, a female officer had helped her repin it when it slipped from her collar. She remembered the woman's hands. Careful, gentle, adjusting the wooden crucifix with surprising reverence. At the time, Lieselot had been too numb to feel anything. But tonight, under the glow of a single flickering lamp, that memory returned like a seed catching warmth after frost. Outside, the wind picked up. The thin walls creaked. Someone coughed into a blanket. Then Greta spoke again. "I keep thinking about what they must have thought of us when we first arrived." She looked up, her eyes wet. "We came off that train with heads high, even in surrender. We carried ourselves like soldiers, like we still believed. But they must have seen it in our eyes. The cracks, the shame." Elfriede nodded. "And they fed us anyway." Frau Neumann folded her book shut. "We were taught to measure worth by loyalty. They measured it by hunger." The lamplight flickered low. For a moment, no one said anything. Then Lieselot stood, her boots silent on the wooden floor. She walked to the small metal stove in the center of the barracks. From her pocket, she took the string from the Christmas cookie package and unwrapped it. The cookie crumbled slightly as she held it over the fire, but she didn't let go. She looked at the others. "Not to waste it," she said softly, "but to remember it." Then gently she placed half into the flames. The sweet scent of cinnamon filled the room. Not heavy, not enough to eat, but enough to recall the taste. Elfriede followed. Then Greta. One by one, they each broke a small piece from their parcel, just a crumb, and dropped it into the flame. It was a ritual without words, a burial of false truths, a funeral for the voices that had lied to them. And as the room darkened further, something strange happened. The air did not grow heavier, but lighter. Not hopeful, not yet, but less burdened. As if grief shared became something else, not defeat, understanding. Lieselot watched the last ember flicker and whispered, almost to herself, "Let it burn, then. What they told us." The room was silent again, but the silence was no longer hollow. It was peace. Morning came gently to Camp Hearne, not with sirens or shouting, but with the soft rattle of wind against tin and the creaking of frost-bent wires. A pale sun filtered through the windows of the barracks, casting long lines across the wooden floors like the bars of a cage that no longer held. Lieselot awoke not from terror, but from the warmth of something deeper than rest, a stillness in her chest that hadn't been there for months. For the first time in captivity, her sleep had not been haunted by air raid sirens or the sharp crack of boots on pavement. She rose slowly, eyes adjusting to the pale light, and saw the brown paper parcel still folded near her bunk. A crumb remained from the cookie they hadn't burned. She picked it up and held it to her lips, not to eat but to feel the weight of memory on her tongue. Across the barracks, others stirred. A few whispered morning prayers. One woman brushed her hair in silence, using a shard of mirror they had hidden inside a boot heel. Another stitched a loose button back to her blouse with a trembling hand. Yet beneath all the quiet motion, something had shifted. They no longer moved like prisoners. Outside, the guards walked their usual path, rifles slung low, not raised. There were no shouts, no drills, only a nod between men who had shared a Christmas carol from opposite sides of a war. The women were called out for roll call, as always. But this time, as they stood in formation under the low sky, they noticed something strange. One of the guards, a quiet man with sun-darkened skin and tobacco-stained fingers, tipped his cap to them. Just once. Just enough. It felt like forgiveness. Later that morning, as they returned to their barracks, they found a new object sitting on a small wooden table near the stove. A journal, blank, untouched, resting beside a stub of pencil. Greta stared at it as if it were a weapon. "Why would they give us this?" she asked. Frau Neumann answered without turning. "So we can remember, or so we don't forget." Lieselot walked toward it. The cover was thin leather, cracked at the edges. She opened it. The pages inside were clean. Too clean. She ran her finger over the paper, almost afraid to mark it. What stories did they carry now? What truth deserved ink after all they had believed? Elfrida said softly, "If we write what really happened, no one will believe us." Lieselot nodded. "Then write anyway. For the ones who come after, for the ones who still believe what we once did." That afternoon, the routine of the camp returned. Work assignments were issued. The laundry, the kitchen, the infirmary. But everything felt slower, not in the steps, but in the gaze. The guards watched differently. The women carried themselves not with pride, but with dignity. A difference as subtle as the space between fear and breath. At the camp's small garden plot, half-frozen rows of winter cabbage, Lieselot and Greta worked side by side. Greta, who once carried official documents stamped with Reich eagles, now dug her hands into the American earth. She said, almost laughing, "It's rich soil. My father would have liked it here." Lieselot nodded. The food they served, it tasted like things planted with care. Greta wiped dirt from her fingers. "I thought we were the careful ones, the organized, the disciplined. But now..." She looked up, eyes narrowing. "Now I wonder what we were really growing." No one answered. Back in the mess hall, a small bulletin board had been placed beside the stove. On it was pinned a simple page: "To the women of Camp Hearne. We thank you for your discipline and respect during the holidays. May the year ahead bring peace, wherever you are. Captain R. Delaney, U.S. Army." There was no sermon, no politics, just those words. A closing of a chapter. Frau Neumann copied the message into the new journal. In careful script, she wrote underneath, "December 26, 1945. The Americans gave us Christmas. And then they gave us silence. Not to forget, but to begin again." That night, as the stove warmed the barracks and the wind whispered faintly through the eaves, Lieselot pulled out her brother's cross. She stared at it a long time, then slowly tied the frayed cord tighter. The fire had burned away the lies, but it had not burned her faith, not in flags, not in leaders, but in something older. In the way bread passed between strangers without fear. In the way a song sung in two languages could sound like one. In the way a cookie, wrapped in string, could carry the weight of redemption. She lay down and pulled the blanket over her shoulders. Somewhere, far beyond the fences, the world still roared with confusion. But here, for one night more, there was quiet. There was the rustle of pages, the creak of wood, and the breath of women learning how to live again. But not every heart was ready to be unchained. While some women warmed to the slow burn of awakening, others watched from the edges, silent as shadows. Behind polite nods and cautious cooperation, certain eyes stayed cold, lips pressed tightly shut, hands folded with military precision. They said little at meals, offered no verse during carols, and turned away when laughter stirred the air. It was not defiance. It was grief in a uniform too tight to shed. Among them was Brunhilde Stahl, a former administrator from Berlin. Stern-faced, sharp-featured, her hair always pinned perfectly, her coat always buttoned to the throat. She had not touched the pie. She had not joined the singing. And when the American woman handed her the small brown package on Christmas night, she had placed it, unopened, into her coat pocket and walked away. Brunhilde had believed, not in the cruelty perhaps, but in the structure, the doctrine. Order had given her purpose. Uniforms had meant dignity. When the Reich collapsed, it wasn't just a government that fell. It was the scaffolding of her identity. Now she sat, each evening, apart from the circle. Her hands remained busy with needle and thread, her gaze fixed beyond the wire fences as if watching for something. Orders, rescue, explanation, that would never come. One afternoon, as the winter sun slanted across the gravel yard, Lieselot approached her. Not to confront, not to convert, just to offer a small tin cup of coffee. It was warm, faintly sweetened, steam curling into the brittle December air. Brunhilde looked at it, then at Lieselot. "Pity?" she asked, voice low, clipped. "No," Lieselot replied. "Company." Brunhilde took the cup, but did not drink. Instead, she said, "You sing with them now. You write in that book. You smile." Lieselot nodded. Brunhilde's eyes narrowed. "How can you forget what they did to us? What they bombed? What they called us?" "I haven't forgotten," Lieselot said. "But I've seen something else too." Brunhilde stared a moment longer, then returned her eyes to the fence. Behind her, in the barracks, Elfrida read aloud from a worn English book, learning slowly, mispronouncing words and giggling when corrected. A few others clapped softly when she finished a full page without stumbling. Brunhilde didn't look back, but her knuckles whitened where she gripped the cup. That evening, a meeting was called. Not official, there were no officers left, but a quiet gathering of voices. The camp administrator had allowed them to use the mess hall again. The benches were filled with women, some leaning forward, some arms crossed. In the center sat the journal. "We must decide," Frau Neumann said gently, "what story we leave behind. This book, someone will read it. Someday. Maybe our children, maybe theirs." A few nodded, others looked away. Greta stood. "Then we must be honest," she said. "We believed things that were not true, and we followed people who broke the world." A murmur ran through the room. Uncomfortable, necessary. Brunhilde stood suddenly, her voice cold and clear. "And you would write shame into our legacy?" "No," Greta answered softly. "Truth. So that shame doesn't return." Brunhilde looked around. No one met her gaze. The walls had shifted, quietly, without battle. The authority she once wore like armor had melted without resistance. She walked out without another word. That night, as the others returned to their bunks, Lieselot found herself lingering outside. The sky was thick with cloud, the moon hidden. Wind carried the faint scent of cedar and distant smoke from the guard tower's stove. She saw Brunhilde standing alone near the far fence, her coat tight, the unopened cookie still in her hand. "You came to the meeting," Lieselot said gently. Brunhilde didn't answer. "I used to think silence was strength," Lieselot added. "Now I think it's fear wearing a proud face." Still nothing. Then, softly, Brunhilde said, "I was 12 when they burned the books. I watched. I said nothing." Lieselot waited. "I told myself it was for order, that history could be rewritten, that we were cleansing." She shook her head. But the ash never left the air, not once, even in spring. A pause, a breath. Then she held out the cookie. "I didn't eat it," she whispered. "I didn't want to taste kindness, because if I did, the whole lie would fall apart." Liselott took the cookie, broke it in half, handed one piece back. "Then let it fall," she said. Together, without speaking further, they ate under the stars, not for forgiveness, but for truth. The days after Christmas passed quietly, as if the snowless Texas wind had swept away something invisible but heavy. The fences still stood, the guards still walked their rounds, and the daily duties of camp life returned: latrine scrubbing, uniform patching, endless folding of blankets, and re-washing of already clean dishes. But something beneath the surface had shifted. It was not victory, not healing, not yet, but something closer to permission. Permission to feel again, to question, to remember without bitterness. It began with a letter. Greta was the first. One cold morning, as frost glazed the water pumps and the mess hall smelled of weak oatmeal and canned milk, she asked the camp supervisor, a thin man with a slight stutter and patient eyes, for paper and a pen. "To write home?" he asked. "No," she said. "To write what home might be, if I survive this." He didn't argue. Later that day, a small stack of Army-issue stationery appeared in the barracks, left discreetly on the edge of the stove. No one touched it at first. To write meant to remember, and remembering risked collapse. But by nightfall, Greta had already filled her first page. Liselott followed, then Frau Neumann, then Elfriede, though her spelling was erratic and her grammar more hopeful than correct. They wrote by lamplight, beneath thin blankets, huddled near the stove or pressed against the walls for privacy. Most did not send the letters. They had no addresses left to write to. Cities were gone, parents buried, siblings unaccounted for, lost in snowbanks of eastern fields or crushed beneath Allied bombs. Some didn't know if the people they loved were even still German, or just names tied to places that no longer existed. So they wrote not to anyone, but to themselves, years from now. "To the child I hope to meet, to the man I hope returns, to the woman I hope I become." Some wrote apologies, others wrote prayers. A few wrote only fragments, moments trapped like photographs in memory. I remember Mama hanging laundry in April, the smell of soap, her humming. The bread was gone by October, but we still set the table. I told a girl from Munich to report a neighbor. I thought it was duty. Her name was Clara. Each letter was folded with care. Some were placed between mattress boards, others sealed and tucked into sleeves or soles of boots. They were not documents. They were exorcisms. One evening, Elfriede approached Liselott with a single sheet, clutched tightly in both hands. "Can you help me?" she asked. I wanted to sound like I meant it. Liselott read the lines. They were rough, disjointed, but honest. I told myself I was helping, but I was afraid to think differently. I saw kindness once and reported it. I think the man died. I was 15. Liselott didn't correct a word. She folded the page, tied it with string, and gave it back. "Hide it well," she said. "It's the first thing you've ever owned completely." Even Brunhilde wrote, though no one ever saw what she put on paper. She wrote in silence, with the same rigid posture she had carried in the Reich offices. But each night, her eyes softened, and that was enough. The guards noticed too. One of them, a quiet black corporal named Jameson, who worked in the supply shed and rarely spoke. Once passed by the women writing near the mess stove. He paused, looked at the pages. "You telling your stories?" he asked softly. Frau Neumann looked up. "Trying to find them again," she replied. He nodded. My grandma did the same. After she ran from Georgia, she used to say, "If you don't write your story, someone else will, and they'll get it wrong." The next day, more paper appeared. Even the guards didn't ask questions anymore. By the first week of January, the wall above the stove had quietly transformed. No announcement, no permission. It began with one pinned letter, signed only, "To my daughter, someday," then another, and another. Some in German, some in broken English, some anonymous. Together, they formed a patchwork of grief, confession, and reluctant hope, a testimony to war written not by generals or politicians, but by the women who had lived its shadow in silence. Visitors to the camp, officers, Red Cross inspectors, began to stop and read them. A chaplain once stood for nearly an hour, weeping quietly, before returning to his jeep without saying a word. One day, as snow finally fell in thin flakes over the Texas plain, a new letter appeared. It wasn't written by a prisoner. It was signed, "Mrs. Eleanor Ramsey, Hearne Women's Auxiliary. To the women behind the fence, I brought you pie on Christmas. I didn't expect to be changed by it. But I was. You reminded me of daughters, of nieces, of girls with dreams. I hope you find them again. And when you do, teach them to someone else. Teach the world what happens when fear replaces love. May your silence never return." E.R. Brunhilde read it twice. Then she reached into her coat, pulled out her own letter, and pinned it quietly beside Eleanor's. There had been no order, no announcement, no official change in protocol. But one morning in mid-January, after the coldest night of the season, the gate at the east fence, the one nearest the laundry shed, was left unlatched. Not open, just unlatched. The chain lay looped beside the post, the padlock hanging loose, the hinge creaking in the morning wind. No guards nearby, no raised rifles, no sirens. Just the crunch of frost underfoot and the faint caw of a lone crow perched on the wire above. It was Elfrida who noticed first. She had gone to fetch a basket of clean linens. She stood there staring at the gate, her breath visible in the cold, her eyes narrowing in disbelief. Then she backed away slowly and whispered to Lieselotte. "They forgot the lock," but the older women didn't believe it. "A test," muttered Greta. "They're watching to see who breaks rank." Brunhilde said nothing, only stared out the barrack window, jaw clenched. For her, the fence had always been more than barbed wire. It was a symbol of order, of boundaries that gave meaning. An unlocked gate wasn't freedom. It was confusion. Still, no one approached it. By noon, whispers had swept through the camp like a chill through thin coats. "It's open." "They don't care." "We could leave." "But where would we go?" "Would they shoot us?" But the guards remained calm. They said nothing. They moved through the compound as they always did. Light conversation, clipped steps, the occasional nod. And when asked about the gate, one sergeant simply said, "There's nowhere to run but forward." That phrase stuck in Lieselotte's mind. Nowhere to run but forward. It didn't mean escape. It meant change. That evening, as the sun sank behind the red clay fields of Texas, the women gathered again, this time not to write, but to stand. Together, near the gate, the mess of shadows thrown by the low fence lights danced across their faces. It wasn't rebellion that stirred among them. It was something quieter, deeper, a question. If they had once crossed a line, into belief, into silence, into complicity, could they now cross back? Brunhilde stood with them, her arms folded. She didn't speak, but her presence meant more than words. Nearby, Elfrida trembled. "It feels like we're waiting for something," she said. Frau Neumann replied, "We are." After a long silence, Greta stepped forward, not toward the gate, but toward the earth. She knelt and began to dig, her fingers scraping at the frozen soil. The others watched, unsure, until she pulled free a small bundle wrapped in oilcloth. A journal, the one she had buried upon arrival. She opened it. Pages curled from moisture, words smeared. But the first entry was still legible. We were told to be proud. But pride is heavy when worn too long. I hope I survived what I was. She tore the page out, handed it to Liselott, then began tearing more. One by one, the women followed her lead. Pages from hidden notebooks, letters never sent, beliefs never spoken aloud. They built a pile near the gate, not in anger, not in performance, but in reverence. A quiet burial for the parts of themselves that had served lies. A guard stepped forward at last. He had watched from afar, uncertain whether to intervene. But when he reached the edge of the circle, he paused. His name was Corporal Ritchie, a farm boy from Kansas. He had never spoken much to the prisoners. But now, he looked down at the pile of writings, then back at the women. "You done with all that?" he asked gently. Liselott nodded. "Yes." He reached into his jacket and handed her a book of matches. Then he stepped back. The wind had died. The silence was complete. Liselott struck the match. She lit the fire. The smoke rose slowly, curling upward like incense. Not acrid, not violent, just paper turning to ash. Words giving way to air. And as the flames climbed, some of the women began to hum. Not in mourning, but in release. Not Stille Nacht, something older, a lullaby from home, Brunhilde whispered. "I remember this. My mother used to sing it while knitting," Elfrida added softly. "Mine too. She'd hum when the lights went out in the cellar, and just like that, the song wove through them. A thread of memory tied to no government, no flag, just women recalling the warmth of mothers who had once wrapped them in gentleness before the world taught them hardness." When the fire burned low, Liselott stepped toward the gate. She didn't open it. She didn't need to. Instead, she took one step across the threshold, not to escape, but to stand in both worlds at once. Behind her, the prison of belief. Before her, the uncertainty of becoming. The fence remained, but its meaning had changed. It was no longer a wall. It was a mirror. The winter in Texas softened its grip in the days that followed. The frost melted earlier each morning. The wind carried a new warmth, faint but real, like breath returning to lungs that had forgotten how to expand. Something had shifted in the air, in the soil, in the shoulders of the women who rose from their bunks, not just to serve out time, but to live what time was left. Letters still hung above the stove, though many had curled and yellowed in the heat. They were no longer just confessions. They had become witness. A living archive written by the invisible, the ones who had marched behind banners, served under orders, and now sought the quiet redemption of remembering out loud. One day, a Red Cross official arrived unexpectedly. He was tall, severe, with polished shoes that cracked the dry earth as he walked. He inspected the kitchens, the latrines, the medical tent. Then, as his assistant took notes, he asked to visit the women's barracks. Corporal Jameson led him in. The women stood when he entered, not by order, by instinct. Respect without fear. He looked around, taking in the neat beds, the folded linens, the small bundles of shared toiletries laid carefully along the window ledges. Then his eyes landed on the wall of letters. "What is this?" he asked. Frau Neumann stepped forward. "Our story," she said. "The one we couldn't tell during the war." He examined one of the pinned pages. I believed what I was told because it came wrapped in uniforms and songs. But belief without question is not patriotism. It's blindness. The inspector said nothing. Then he nodded once and left. 2 days later, the women received parcels. Large ones. Red Cross crates containing books in German and English, writing supplies, more soap, more thread, And most surprising of all, sheet music. Inside the crate, Elfriede found a faded copy of Beethoven's Ode to Joy. She held it up as if it were treasure unearthed. "Can we play it?" she asked. "We have no instruments," Lieselot reminded her. But that night, they sang it anyway. Just voices, no piano, no conductor, just dozens of women humming and shaping syllables with cracked lips and winter-bitten throats. Alle Menschen werden Brüder. All men will become brothers. Not all women joined. Some sat quietly. Some watched through half-lowered lashes. And that, too, was understood. Transformation did not arrive by force. It bloomed in its own time. Like seed in hard soil, it waited for warmth. One morning, word spread. 2 of the women would be released. Their sentences had been served. Transport would arrive within the week to return them to Germany, or what was left of it. The camp held its breath. Elfriede pulled Lieselot aside. "How can they go back?" she whispered. "To rubble, to silence, to people who might still believe what we once did," Lieselot answered slowly. "Because someone has to return different." The day before departure, the women gathered in the mess hall, not for a meal, but to give. From scraps of fabric, they had sewn small satchels. Inside each one was a letter, signed by many hands, written in both English and German. A message to carry home, if you are reading this. Someone you love survived not just a war, but a lie. They are not who they were, and neither are we. We send them home not as prisoners, but as witnesses. The 2 women wept when they received them. Not loudly. Just the kind of weeping that lives in the throat and shakes the hands. On the morning of departure, the gates opened. This time not with ambiguity, but ceremony. The guards saluted. The chaplain stood in silence. And as the truck pulled away, a line of women raised their hands. Not to wave goodbye, but to send something. A promise. Behind them, Brunhild stood with arms crossed, but her eyes were wet. That night, the wind shifted. It came not from the north, but the east. Across the fence, across the fields. It carried the scent of tilled soil, faint grass, and the slow, silent turning of the earth beneath sleeping roots. Lieselot lay awake in her bunk, hands folded across her stomach, listening to the wind move through the camp like a whisper, too ancient to understand. She thought of her brother, buried somewhere outside Minsk. She thought of her father, dust in Hamburg. And she thought of her mother, whose last letter had ended with, "Stay warm, trust the quiet things." And this wind, it felt like one of those quiet things. She whispered to herself, "If war teaches us to hate by screaming, maybe peace teaches us to love by whispering." Across the aisle, Greta stirred. "Did you say something?" she mumbled. "No," Lieselot said, smiling faintly into the dark. "Just listening." Outside, the wind moved gently across the unlocked gate. Spring came slowly to Camp Hearne. It wasn't marked by flowers or birdsong, but by the sound of boots softening in the mud. By the way the frost no longer clung to the windows in the morning. By the smell of soap drying on a line, and in the faces of women who began to smile without shame. The war had been over for months, but now, finally, it began to feel over. Each week, another name was called. Another woman prepared to leave. There were no parades, no brass bands. Just quiet goodbyes and bundles tied with string. And the long walk past the gate that had once kept them in. Some wept, some didn't. Some turned back to wave, some didn't, and no one asked them to. Lieselot stood outside the barracks one evening, watching the sun melt into the horizon. In her hand, she held the journal. Its cover now smoothed by time, the pages thick with names, confessions, and truths. She had begun to call it the Book of Becoming. It was no longer just about survival. It was about the journey between who they were told to be and who they chose to become. Inside, On the first page were 5 names. On the last, more than 40. Some entries were long, sprawling memories of childhoods before ideology. Others were single lines etched like scars. I helped, I watched, I stayed silent, I believed, I regret. But others, especially toward the end, carried something new, something tentative, like a flower pushing up through rubble. I listened, I changed, I taught, I wept with my enemy. I forgave myself. The Americans never took the journal. It stayed in the barracks, passed from hand to hand, sometimes read aloud at night in voices shaking with fatigue. It had become their cathedral, their confession booth, their library of rebirth. Elfrida decorated the margins with pencil sketches. Hands clasped, birds in flight, the silhouette of a woman standing at a gate. And Brunhilde, who once refused to sing, had written a poem, folded between 2 blank pages. We came in chains of the mind, fed on certainty, armed with silence. But the quiet things broke us open. A spoonful of pie, a song in 2 tongues, the wind at our backs. We were prisoners, yes, but only until we listened. On the final morning, Liselott awoke to the sound of footfalls near her bed. Greta stood there, already dressed, her hair pulled back neatly. "They called my name," she said quietly. Liselott nodded. She rose and helped Greta fold her coat, pack her few things, a small bar of soap, a Red Cross scarf, the worn toothbrush she refused to leave behind. When they stepped into the yard, the truck was waiting. Brunhilde stood nearby, arms crossed. She looked at Greta, then at Liselotte, and without a word, reached into her pocket and handed over a folded scrap of paper. "For your daughter," she said to Greta, "when she asks what kind of woman you became." Greta nodded, her throat tight. Then she turned and climbed into the back of the truck. There were no speeches, no flags, just the soft rumble of the engine, the dust rising from the wheels, and the sound of someone. Elfrida, perhaps, humming a tune too old to name. And when the truck disappeared down the road, Liselott turned back to the gate. She didn't close it. She didn't need to. Because what they had built here, behind wire, beneath suspicion, beside strangers, was no longer something that could be locked away. They had left something behind. But it wasn't shame. It was a story, a true one, of war, yes, but also of mercy. Of women who were once enemies kneeling together at a stove to burn the lies they had carried. Of letters pinned to a wall that had once divided, now binding them together like pages in the same book. Of a Christmas pie, of a child's smile, of silence that became song, and of a fence that no longer meant captivity, but remembrance. Years later, when Liselott returned to Germany, the country was not the same. Streets renamed, statues removed, neighbors gone, but she carried with her a battered leather book. Its pages yellowed, its corners curled. She read from it sometimes, to school children, to her daughter, to herself. And when asked what the war had taught her, she did not speak of guns or maps. She told them this: "We thought the world would break us with punishment, but it saved us with kindness. The fiercest truth is not shouted. It is handed to you, quietly, gently, on a plate of warm food by someone who should hate you, but chooses not to." And then she would close the book, and the silence that followed would feel holy.